In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about using video news stories in the second language classroom. What I say about using video news will also apply to using movies. Um, basically, what I'm talking about is determining how much visual material in the form of movies, video news, etc., is comprehensible input. Okay, so I've got a couple of aims here. First, here's the question. What is the most comprehensible input that teachers can select from TV news, or it could be from movies or any kind of video source for use in the second language classroom, and also for self-access? And secondly, what is the optimum combination of auditory and visual stimuli in TV news, which facilitates L2 listener decoding? That is, what's the best material we can choose that's going to help second language students practice their listening comprehension? I'm going to be moving through various points. First, I'm going to be talking about my language learning experience and watching movies when I lived in Italy. Then I'm going to talk about a teaching principle about choosing movies for the classroom. Then I'll do a little reflection of when I was teaching in Japan and teaching a class which used TV news. And then I'm going to get onto some theory about the juxtaposition of words and pictures. I'll be looking at some ekphrastic poetry, and that's poetry which can be used is a description of poetry which is describing a particular picture. It's very closely associated with a visual source. And then I'll be looking at specifically the combination of the audio and visual in TV news. And then I'm going to be reporting about an experiment which very much was a pilot study of native speaker and non-native speaker processing of voice-over TV news sequences. So let's start with some anecdotal evidence. When I lived in Italy and was a second language learner, I loved to go to the movies, and the first 10 minutes were always the most difficult because in that particular 10 minutes in the darkness, it was as if you could hear your own brain working, the little wheels functioning, trying to understand what was being said. And after about 10 minutes, it became spontaneous. What I appreciated in terms of understanding, in terms of comprehensible input, was when the spoken text and the visual text overlapped. Okay, so what if, say it's a cowboy, and the cowboy says, "I'm going to pull out my gun," and then pulls out their gun. What you have is a visual representation of the language. And so you can move between the two, between the visual and the auditory spoken text, and begin to understand the particular language. So the principle there was, in choosing movies, is to use spoken action movie sequences where the spoken text was very close to the visual action text. In Japan, I taught a class on current affairs, and I wanted to use as much authentic material as possible, and so I used a lot of TV news. What I discovered in that particular class is something to do with the discourse structure of TV news. So, for example, we can talk about multiple speakers and multiple speech styles. So, in a TV news, and the traditional TV news, we have anchors, we have correspondents, we have experts, interviews with experts, and we have also interviews with people on the street. And if you want a fancy name for those people, vox pops or vox populi, the voice of the people. So those were the different speakers within any news item. There's also a multiplicity of modalities, and perhaps this makes TV news that much more difficult to process because we have all these different modalities. So, for example, we have talking heads. A talking head is where you look at the TV or the monitor and the head fills the whole screen. So that's a talking head. Then you have voiceovers. You hear somebody talking, but you don't see them, and you just have pictures, images. Then you have a lot of graphics, and you have captions. So if you're watching Fox News or CNBC, there's always there, or CNN is the classic one, the little ticker thing on the bottom. Those are always going on at the same time you're seeing visual images and you're hearing or watching a talking head. And finally, you have the visual images, the film or animation. So there's a lot of things going on in TV news. If we think about some of the theory about the juxtaposition of words and pictures, one of the earliest people to talk about this relationship is Barth, and he talked about the primacy of the word, and he believed it was the word that anchored the image. Now, we can go either way on this. Does the image illuminate the word? Does the word illuminate the image? Kress and Van Leuven have done a lot of work on this, talk about the autonomy of the image and how we can talk about the grammar of images and how images are a separate code of information. Other authors have tried to integrate the two, like Salomon, who talks about whole message units, the visual and the auditory. And if we want to make a distinction, we can talk about auditory and visual and words and images. We're putting those two together, so it's an interaction of the two. So, just to summarize that, we have words, we have pictures. Which has primacy? According to Barth, it's words. According to Kress and Van Leuven, it's more images. And then we have an interactional approach which says they work together to create whole message units. Here's a quote from Gruber, I think is interesting about the juxtaposition of words and pictures. Visual elements do not merely provide support for verbal elements. They are better thought of as an integral element in video text that interplay with verbal elements to influence a listener's emerging interpretation. So this is very much the summing up of this interactional approach. What we understand from TV news is not just the spoken track by itself, it's not just the visual track by itself, it's an interaction of the two. Okay, I promise you some ekphrastic poetry, and this is a very famous poem by Leda and the Swan by W.B. Yeats. And this is pretty adult poetry, it's pretty X-rated stuff, as you will understand. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, the thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? It's pretty sexy stuff. To understand this particular poem, you need to understand something of the mythology of Leda and the Swan, and you need to understand that this particular poem is based on a visual image, and that's a particular rendering of this particular myth. There's Leda, as you can see, very voluptuous, and there is the swan, and notice the shape of the swan, that's very sexualized shape. So to understand that particular poem and to understand the kind of choices, grammatical choices, as well as vocabulary, you need to be able to read it and look at the picture. That's the notion of ekphrastic poetry. There's a relationship between the words and the pictures. You can't understand the poem without the picture, and you can't really understand the picture without the poem. Similarly, and on a much more mundane level, tourist guides, exhibition catalogs work on this ekphrastic level. So if you take any guidebook, the guidebook can only make sense and is on and if you are actually in the place that it's guiding you around. So for example, on the left here, we have an extract from a tour guide, and we're in Florence. The graceful loggia in the Florentine Gothic style with round arches, okay, which you see before you on the left of the altar. Okay, so this is the kinds of things we find in a tourist guide. And then compare that with the poem of Leda and the Swan. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still, which you can see in the left part of the picture. Above the staggering girl, on the right. Okay, so there's this kind of relationship of many texts which require a visual feel, and that basically is the notion of the way that TV news works. Here's an example, and this is an example that I'm going to be talking about later in an experiment. And this particular TV news was about the explosion which happened in TW8 Flight 800. This is an airplane that took off from New York many years ago now, and shortly after takeoff exploded. In this particular clip, which I used in the experiment I'll talk about later, this particular spoken text occurred as a voiceover of an animation, and the animation duplicated the spoken text. So some 12 minutes after takeoff, and what we're seeing now is a plane going vertically up at about 13,400 feet. The center fuel tank explodes, and we see an animated explosion, and then seconds later we see the nose rips off, and we see that animated. But the rest of the plane, with engines running, continues upwards. Streams of fire spewing from the crippled jetliner. People looking up then mistook the flaming fuselage for a missile. The fuselage begins to fall and twist, with the left wing breaking off. Jet fuel erupts into a fireball. One of the effects was that the people were looking at this and then later heard the explosion because the sound waves are traveling slower. Anyway, this particular news item had that text together with an animation which was illustrating this particular text. So what we have is something that's very similar to Leda and the Swan. You can only really understand this text as long as you're looking at the animated version of this particular plane disaster. We can now begin to break down the relationship of words and pictures into four distinct parts. And the first part I'm going to say is symbolic. And symbolic means that the words and the visuals that are tangentially related. The visuals illustrate the discourse or sentence topic. A lot of TV news uses visuals to kind of break up the news. Instead of having a talking head, then it'll go to the video library and show you pictures of something which is related to the topic, but it's not actually related to what is being said, in the sense it's not illustrative of what is being said. I'm going to give you some examples of this at the moment. The second is referential, and here the visuals illustrate people, places, and things referred to in the audio text. And what you get is a picture of the person we're talking about, or a picture of a place, or a picture of thing. It's referential in the sense that it's very isolated. You just get one particular picture that goes with these particular people, places, things. The next set of relationships, and we're getting more complex in terms of the relationships of words and pictures, is schematic. And what I mean here is diagrams, use of charts, tables, captions, which offer a schematic representation of the audio text. So what you're looking at now in terms of this PowerPoint is a schematic representation of what I'm saying. I'm not saying exactly what's on that page, but I'm using that as a schematic representation of what I'm saying. I'm filling it out. Finally, and this is the most powerful relationships in words and pictures, is iconic. And that particular text we just read, together with the animated version of that plane disaster, is an example of iconic relationship between words and pictures. The videotaped events, incidents, or simulations where the spoken text parallels the visual text. Okay? So let me give you some examples of that. And I'm sorry I'm not able to give you the actual video examples, but I think you can understand from the written text and the description of the visual, the relationship that's going on here. So here's an example of the symbolic relationships of words and images. This was a TV news story about Senator John Glenn actually going back into space, which he did about 20 years ago at the age of 80, I believe. So those are the particular scenes, and then the next column is the central visual feature. That's the time in terms of seconds, and then you've got the spoken voice over the text. So we'll just read down the spoken text here. Dr. Christina Casal joins a chorus of aging specialists and others who doubt that Glenn, as guinea pig, will provide breakthroughs. Because they were hoping that, well, he's going into space at the age of 80 again, we can find stuff out. So that was spoken. Now look at what we saw. For 1 second, we saw the start of a sprint race at a senior athletics meeting. Runners in their box, sound of a starting gun, and athletes look to be in their 60s and older. Then it cuts to same sprint race, runners are sprinting in their lanes. Notice the spoken text is joins a chorus of aging specialists. Then the next cut to the next scene is these older athletes, 60 plus, are doing the long jump. And at the same time we hear, and others who doubt. And then the fourth scene, the fourth cut, it's a woman in her 50s competing in a swimming race. And we hear the words, that Glenn as guinea pig will provide breakthroughs. So what we've got is a visual representation of older people doing sports. And then the spoken text is about aging, but there's no relationship between the pictures of people doing sport and the spoken text. It's the only relationship is symbolic related in the terms of the fact we're talking about aging. And that's very common in TV news. But it's not very helpful in helping you understand the spoken voiceover text. Here's the next example of something which is referential, picks out a place or a person or a thing. So in this one, this particular news item was about IDEO, which is a design company. And there's a shot of Dave Kelly, who's the CEO of this particular company, standing by shelving. He takes a sneaker off the shelf, and there is a close-up of a monster head, laced into the shoe. Some kind of idea where they had a monster laced into it, the head of a monster. And then we have the spoken voice over text. I can show you some products that failed. Came up with this idea called monster shoes, where you take these little monsters and lace them into your shoes, like this. And we built a bunch of them, and they didn't want those either. So the idea of this monster laced into a shoe is illustrated. You just get a picture of it. So I'm calling that referential. Okay, you just get one shot. Notice it refers to that particular thing, but it doesn't actually help us that much in trying to understand that this is a failure of this design company. Next, we have the schematic relationship of words and images. And this particular TV story was about census data. So if you look at the spoken voiceover text, the average family's net worth has gone up almost $4,000 in 3 years. People are using credit cards more. More than half say they use them now. Less than a third actually pay them off. And then finally, the average family spends $1,800 a year on entertainment, movies, books, and video rentals included. It's a little out of date, this, of course. We don't have video rentals so much anymore. And then if we look at the central visual feature, we have pictures of crowds walking down a sidewalk. Well, that's a pretty symbolic relationship if we're talking about the average family's net worth. But what we have next to that is, over the visuals, we have a caption. Medium net worth, $56,400. So notice we're getting some additional information which is actually not mentioned in the spoken text. So they're all working together. In the next scene, we're in a store. These are the visuals. It's a close-up of a sales clerk making an imprint of a credit card. And the camera draws back to show customers on the other side of the counter. Again, it's a symbolic relationship. Spoken text says people are using credit cards more. More than half say they use them now. Less than a third actually pay them off. And then we have the caption, which is more specific information. 56% have credit cards, 28% hardly ever pay off. And then finally, we see a picture of a lady in a movie theater box office giving tickets to a customer. And the spoken text is voiceover. The average family spends $1,800 a year on entertainment, movies, books, and videos. Again, it's a symbolic relationship. And then we have the caption, which is more specific, gives a more specific number of 1,775. So that's a schematic relationship, and you can begin to see how the integration of the three different elements begins to help the understanding of the message. Finally, we have the iconic relationship, and this is the ideal relationship, I will argue, in terms of comprehensible input in allowing learners, especially learners, to be able to move between the spoken and the visual and the spoken, to be able to understand what is being said. So here we have the central visual feature is one of IDEA's design team is in a supermarket demonstrating this particularly new shopping cart they've designed. And this particular shopping cart comes with your own scanner, so you can scan your own items as you're going around the supermarket, so you don't have to bother going through checkout at the end. So here's the spoken text. All right. Here's how you would scan an item. you reach over and pick up anything like this salad dressing. So what we're doing is the person actually demonstrating this particular scanner. And I would scan it, and if I wanted to accept that item, I would just press plus and then drop it into my basket. What's interesting here is the choice of language. Notice the hypothetical would, because what we're seeing when we see this particular person with this scanner, he's actually pantomiming it. He's not actually doing it. And so that helps us understand why he's chosen would uh, um, uh, to describe this pantomiming. So that's an iconic relationship. The words and the pictures map perfectly. Okay, let me talk briefly about this particular study. And it's an attempt to um, look at iconic and symbolic relationships between words and pictures. And it's 31 native speakers and non-native speaker subjects. Questions it's trying to respond to is, are iconic TV news sequences more comprehensible? And do iconic TV news sequences make the spoken text more accessible to the learner decoding? Um, I used various measures of comprehensibility. What you can see here is that I had three groups actually. I had native speakers, and I had two groups of non-native speakers, advanced and intermediate. And I showed them that particular news item about the airplane disaster. And so the iconic or original version of that was that spoken text describing what happened to the airplane together as a voiceover with an animated representation of what happened. That's iconic. With the other group, the symbolic group, I took away that animation and just showed pictures of airplanes taxiing along the runway. So that was symbolically related to the topic of airplanes, but it was not iconic in the sense it wasn't matching the spoken text. I had various questions, open-ended questions, true, false, etc. And as you can see, the mean score in the native speakers was slightly higher with the iconic, and as you move down the list, the advanced was higher than the um, the um, the iconic was higher with non-native speakers, advanced than the symbolic group, and then again and a slightly larger margin with the non-native speaker intermediate group, greater comprehensibility of the iconic. Uh, this is a pilot study. As you can see, the numbers are pretty small, so it needs bigger numbers than this to confirm this hypothesis. When we looked at other things, we looked at free recall, as well as asking them questions. I asked them to write a description of what they understood had happened. And I looked at various variables to understand, to compare these two. I looked at word count, information units. Did they have the same word as was used in the script on the TV, the voiceover? And then I also looked at tense, past and non-past. So if you look at the iconic group, again, you see their scores are higher with the native speakers. They used more words, they used more information units, and they used more often the same word that was used in the script. So they were getting greater access to the spoken text because of the visuals. And interesting, if you look at the tense, notice the greater use of the non-past or present tenses. Because the description, if you remember, if you go back, was mainly in the present tense rather than the past tense. And that gives it a certain kind of immediacy because you have the images that you can describe. So it's more often using the present tense. If you look at the non-native speakers, the advanced, again you see are, in their free call written descriptions, they use far more more words, a lot more information units. They more often use the same word as in the script, and slightly more. They use the past tense, of course, a lot more, but um, uh, they use the past tense less than the symbolic group. And then if you looked at the other group, the intermediate group, um, a similar pattern of differences there, although the numbers are very small, of course. Okay. Um, okay. Later in the Swan was subject of a study by Halliday, and he talked about the decline of verbality. And what he did was a very neat stylistic analysis of that poem, in which he broke it down into independent finite clauses, dependent finite clauses, dependent non-finite, qualifying finite and non-finite clauses, and another group which is items in in noun phrases. Without going too deeply into that, we can represent that visually, and when I compared this with the script for the TWA flight, and as you can see, we can describe it in very similar categories. If you want to represent that visually, then the top one, the original one, is a visual representation of the TWA 800 script. Okay, the colors represent the different particular clauses. And as you can see here, the iconic group, that's the group that heard the original version with the animation, in their recall, were far closer to the original script than the symbolic group. Okay, so that gives you a further evidence that it's the iconic relationship of words and images is going to be far better for um, to give you access to the language that's being used in an iconic relationship. That, by the way, is comparing the native speakers. Okay, so I'm going to summarize here and cut to the chase and just conclude. What have we learned here? Well, the more iconic a TV news item, the more iconic a movie item, the greater the comprehensibility. And second, because of this, because the visual text works to allow you to access the spoken text far more, as we saw in the results. The benefits in terms of listening, in terms of the cognitive processes for L2 learners, are far greater. So what we need to do in terms of materials in TV news, movies, is choose particular elements where you have this strong iconic relationship between words and pictures.